So 1630s, Rembrandt's working for Allenberg and slowly but surely staving out on his own and getting increasingly good commissions. He maintains friends with Huygens. Huygens introduces him to the prince's house, right? He gets a set of commissions for them. And he also begins to make a significant amount of money as an increasingly in-demand portrait painter, right? And it kind of makes sense because all of the skills that he's developed as a biblical painter, is developing as a biblical painter, are also skills that translate into portrait painting. People, characterization, costume, right? Gesture, right? Enlivening the picture. These make for great portraits as well. And Rembrandt is just this, really is, almost becomes a portrait painter first and foremost, against his better intentions, right? That's not what he wants to do, but that's what the majority of the works in the 1630s are, portraits, because it's easy money, right? And he's also just really good at it, and he's picking up little tricks. When we were in the Rijksmuseum, we were looking at how he paints lace, right? And how good he is with these black costumes, and how good he is with characterizing these different people from young to old. Did you guys hear Mariah was saying about Maria Tripp that she was apparently horrendously ugly, and that Rembrandt has made her, she's still not entirely attractive, she's kind of wall-eyed, but he's made her look better than she did, and she apparently started getting offers, courtship offers, after the picture was painted. The Trippen House, is right on the edge. So when we were at the clandestine church, just down that canal on the left is the Trippen House, on the opposite side of the Tripp family mansion, and it's huge. It's like 6 row houses across. It's massive, and that's where the Rijksmuseum was when it was before they built the building. That was where the Rijksmuseum collection was originally housed, and it was while it was there. No, it wasn't. It was already trimmed down by then. But the night watch was on view at the Tripp family mansion for a long time. So it's just that big of a house. But in both of these, right? First, Rembrandt's range of styles is something he can manipulate for the patron. So, there is a tendency to think about Rembrandt's style moving from tight when he's young to expressive and loose when he's old. And if you were to trace an overall trajectory, that's kind of the direction it goes. And that's fairly common for a lot of artists to start off tight and end up loose. Titian, Picasso, El Greco, right? All sort of following the same. Michelangelo followed the same trajectory. Michelangelo's sculpture gets looser. But you'll notice that the much more expressive brushwork in the earlier picture of the two here. And that's because what Rembrandt can do is he seems to be able to manipulate. His skill with handling paint is so strong that he can tighten it up, loosen it up, depending on what people want from him, right? So it's something that he is in absolute control of, is his handling of paint. And in this case, he makes it thicker, gummier, more obvious brushstrokes to get the age of the character, right, of the woman. But in each of them, there's this sense that there's something more going on. She's not really standing in that chair. It's like she's standing in front of the chair, right, with her arm on the armrest. Same kind of chair in the old woman on the left, but right, she's not really looking at you, right? But she's thinking, because I love this idea that she's got her Bible. She's got her finger in the Bible. And portrait conventions, right? When we talk about portraits as a way of making pictures, early on there's sort of two conventions. One is that they look directly at you, and sometimes this can be boring. We make them do something, but Rembrandt goes a step further. He really makes portraits do things, right? So it's a portrait, but she's caught in this. There's something else about her character there. She's been reading her Bible, and she stopped reading for a minute. She's marked the place, and she's taken off her glasses, so she can't read it. And she's not taken off her glasses to talk to you. Well, she's taken off her glasses to think about what she's just read. And it's this sort of wonderful way of capturing the inner vitality of the person, right? You don't need your glasses when you're thinking. You need your glasses when you're reading. And she's not reading anymore. She's visualizing. She's ruminating. She's thinking it through, right? But obviously the book is crucial. The book is key, right? But there's this idea that Rembrandt is, I think, dealing with, which is the difference between physical sight and spiritual sight, right? Which is a theme that he loves throughout the rest of his career anyway. Many of his sitters are very well-placed people. Uten Bogart, for example. Both of these, he was a Remonstrant preacher. And he had actually fallen into disfavor. He had been at the court of Prince Moritz, the son of William of Orange, in The Hague, right? But in 1618, Moritz turned against the Remonstrants. He was a Remonstrant Calvinist preacher. The Remonstrants were very, very tolerant. The Remonstrants believed that all religions in Holland should be tolerated. They believed that each one of the provinces should be able to determine what was the religion for that province. And in 1618, Prince Moritz decided that he wanted the state to determine a national religion. So he started turning his back on the Remonstrants, right, who were much more tolerant, and wanted a single state religion. And Bogart goes into exile because he's one of the most prominent of the Remonstrants at this point. 7 years later, right, Moritz dies. He's replaced by Frederick Hendrik, who's much more tolerant. Bogart comes back, sort of in triumph, if you will, right? And that's what the inscription down below is all about. He's come back from exile. And we think that both of these pictures might have been commissioned by the Remonstrants to commemorate their great leader, right? The preacher Bogart. And in both of them, he obviously appears prominently with the book, right? So Rembrandt, as a portraitist, is not only in painting but also in printmaking. Is very much active as a portraitist. He does another image of Bogart, where later on he becomes the receiver general, the tax collector, for the province of Holland, and this is to commemorate now his new job, right? 6 years later. And Rembrandt has worked the print up very elaborately, room for an inscription across the bottom, but you'll notice he hasn't finished the face yet, right? There are, through states, right? He works it up and pulls proofs off before he's finished to show him in this new regard, and then eventually to finish up the face, right? So portraits are a key part of what he's doing. We spent a lot of time talking about this pair, another recent acquisition by the Rijksmuseum of Martin and Oppian. And we even found out all sorts of technical stuff about them, right? But these are important for him. And again, you saw the size of these things, right? They tower over you. And as such, these are certainly they're prestige pieces for the people, but they're prestige pieces for Rembrandt too, right? They're cut from a single bolt of fabric, and they're massive scale. You've seen the inside of some of these houses, right? Where would they go? Portrait of this size. And then, of course, there's the famous Dr. Tulp, which we've already talked about, right? These are really important portraits that is keeping Rembrandt afloat in the 1630s and really increasing his prestige, certainly increasing his wealth, right? Displacing on a certain level his interest in becoming a history painter, although he gets a few of those commissions along the way as well. And what this means is that by the end of the 1630s, he's arrived. right? He is where he wants to be. He is a gentleman painter. He's wealthy. He's well established. He's well recognized. He is in demand as a portraitist. And does self-portraits throughout his entire career. We'll look at more of them next week probably. But these are definitely the artist as gentlemen. And they're interesting portraits in that respect as the artist as gentleman, because they're both obviously reworking the same idea, even though the print came first, right? But dressed in absolutely fine clothes, leaning on a sill, nifty beret to cover up his bald spot, right? But in addition to that, both of these images are based on very prominent earlier pictures, not by Rembrandt, but by very prominent Renaissance artists, right? And so I'm going to keep the print up and show you these. One of them, Rembrandt saw at a sale in 1639. Raphael's portrait of Castiglione was actually sold in Amsterdam. Rembrandt attended the sale. That's Rembrandt's handwriting on a sketch that he made when Castiglione was sold. And you can see the degree to which this has been translated into Rembrandt's own self-image that same year, right? So he is modeling himself not only as a maker of images after Raphael, but as a sitter in the image after Castiglione. You guys know Castiglione? Baldassare Castiglione? He wrote The Courtier, which was dedicated to the Medici family, and was the manual on how to be a court member. And what were the ideals of the perfect member of court? Right? What were the ideals of being a Renaissance gentleman, basically? Right? Do everything good enough, but nothing excellent. Right? Do everything well. Be a Renaissance man, right? That really comes out of Castiglione's Courtier, right? And it was dedicated to the Medici family. And Rembrandt probably knew that because he seems to have had access to a translation of various biographies of Italian artists, right? So he's got, by modeling himself after this, two things. One is he becomes the courtier himself as the sitter. But Raphael, painter to the popes, right? To two different popes. For Rembrandt the artist, that's also an extraordinary role model, right? And this fits into that Rembrandt's ambition that we talked about at the beginning of class, right? The guy who bought this picture, right, already owned this one by Titian, right? And you can see that Rembrandt's also channeling that, right? So he probably had access to it. Amsterdam's a small world, right? Now, Titian's picture, every bit as important, because Titian is, if anything, even more important of an artist in the social structure than Raphael was. Raphael was painter to the Pope. Titian was painter to the Holy Roman Emperor. In fact, he was so good as a painter. He stayed in Venice, but he made frequent travels to Spain to work for the Holy Roman Emperor. And as a painter, his paintings were so successful working for the court that the Holy Roman Emperor gave him the status of landed gentry, gave him a title, and made it retroactive back 2 or 3 generations in his family, which was a huge thing. And there's an anecdote once that while painting in Spain, that the emperor came to visit him, and Titian dropped his brush, and the emperor stooped down to pick it up for him. Right? I mean, he's the quintessential court painter. Right? So for Rembrandt, this is also a huge thing. The other thing that Rembrandt would have known about Titian is that Titian's trajectory of art Starts tight, ends loose. He lives to be about 95, right? And his late paintings are extraordinarily sketchy, in a good way, right? Not sketchy in teen slang, right? Uh, Loose, open brushwork, which is exactly where Rembrandt goes, right? And even have a similar tonality. So this is kind of an important little moment in Rembrandt's life, right? End of the 30s, okay? So he's really is channeling this idea of the artist gentleman. He's made his money with some reluctance, I think, as a portrait painter, right? He doesn't hate them, but it's obviously not the noble kind of art he'd hoped to be making. This is probably part of the reason that his portrait paintings break the bounds of portraiture, right? So the Night Watch is a group portrait, but Rembrandt turns it into a narrative scene, a sort of unspecified narrative scene, right? And is for him sort of the culmination of this extraordinary period of success, this 10 years in Amsterdam, between 1630 and 1642. He gets the commission in 39 for the Night Watch. Each of the people paid him 100 guilders to be in the portrait. 100 guilders is roughly half of an annual salary. And Rembrandt got 22 of these. That's a huge hunk of change for Rembrandt to pick up for this portrait. Now, granted, the canvas and the materials are going to cost him quite a bit, and it's going to be 3 years of work. But this was a big commission, right? This was really major for this militia guild that protects the city, right? To be hung in the house where all the other portraits of similar guilds were hung. It no longer exists. The Cloveniers do. We walked right by it, actually. We're very close to that, right? But he takes the money and he uses it to buy a house, right? A big house that's still there, the Rembrandt house. And it's right next to where Aulenberg's studio used to be. I want to know more about that, because he's not working for Aulenberg anymore. He didn't do this while working for Aulenberg, right? This is a good 5 years after they've working their separate ways, and he goes back and sets up shop right next door, right? So what's with that rivalry? What's going on there? I would like to know more about how that went down with Aulenberg, right? Or was this just the kind of place where, you walk down Lower Manhattan and you get in the Chelsea's boom, 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 boom art galleries, and that's just what you go for? Is that a possibility as well? But there's Rembrandt's original house that he bought with the money he got from the Night Watch, right? So it's extraordinarily successful. Okay. Now, with the Night Watch, there is a myth around it that it ruined his career. That he was so extraordinarily innovative with the portrait that it messed him up. Statistically, we know that while the 1630s for Rembrandt were extraordinarily successful, the 1640s were extraordinarily problematic, as were the early 50s, to the point that in 1656 he declares bankruptcy. Right? So this climb to fame that we've been witnessing over the first 15 years becomes a descent into insolvency in the second 15 years. Right? The question is why? Right in the middle of all that is the Night Watch. And so this myth rose up that, that caused his downfall. Right? This isn't entirely true. It was very, very well received at first. It was very highly praised. It will outlive all its competitors, somebody said on seeing it. Right? This will be the one, and it's true. That's exactly what happened. Nobody cares about the other pictures that were there, right? Students of group portraiture do, but this is the one everybody knows, right? They said it will outlive all its competitors, and why? Because it's so painterly in conception. In other words, they're praising exactly what Rembrandt sometimes is criticized for. So daring in its invention, so It's a great little line, right? Everybody else looks like they're just posed and stiff, like a deck of cards. And this is alive, right? So it was quite beloved at the time. So whatever happened to Rembrandt in the 1640s, it wasn't because of the Night Watch. It's kind of the bottom line. That said, what did it, right? Why did Rembrandt's prominent commissions, particularly portraits, start to dry up in the 1640s? Why does he have to rely on a very small and decreasing circle of benefactors to keep his business afloat? And even at that, still fail. This is a question that's open-ended, but one of the things we do know is that he was leading an irregular lifestyle. We'll talk about that for a little bit. Right? Go into Rembrandt's biography. At the same time he gets the commission for the Night Watch, Saskia gets sick. She gets tuberculosis. She's deeply, deeply ill. And she's bedridden for the better part of 3 years off and on. She finally dies the same year the Night Watch is finished in 1642. So he is in a bad way, emotionally speaking, it seems, through the late 30s and into the early 40s. It's exactly at this time that he starts to do landscape drawings, which is kind of fun to think about. Poor Rembrandt walking around, right? His wife is dead. He's going to go wander off in the countryside and make drawings of the landscape. I don't know how true that all is, but there's a coincidence there. In 1643, after Saskia died, Rembrandt hired a wet nurse because Saskia had a child that had lived, Titus, little Titus, right? And the woman that he hires is named Gertrude Dirks. Right? She's going to be Titus's carekeeper. And they begin to have a sexual relationship. But remember that Rembrandt can't remarry. Right? He's got that rider on the dowry from Saskia's family. It says if he remarries, he's got to pay the money back. He ain't got it anymore, right? He's spent it all. So he's having this affair with Gertrude Dirks. Can't marry her, right? He loses inheritance. So they stay together from 1643 to around 1648 or so, 5 years, under Rembrandt's household. And in a Calvinist society, however tolerant they might have been in some ways, this is not smiled upon in every circle, in every corner. And as such, some of Rembrandt's lack of commissions in the 40s may come from a turning away from Rembrandt the man, not Rembrandt the artist. Right? Now, it gets ugly. Around 1647, 1648, Rembrandt starts an affair with another woman, Hendrikje Stoffels, who will stay with him for the rest of his life, next 20 years, right? He breaks up with Gertrude Dirks. He tries to fire him. He wants to give her a settlement with an annual stipend for firing her. She sues him. What's that? $130,000, right? Paid through his lawyer. Yeah. No, but some current leaders are going for the one-off payment. He was going to give her an annual stipend as well, right? So he's going to look after her, if you will. But it wasn't enough, it seems, and she sued him for breach of contract, saying that he had promised to keep her forever as his common-law wife, right? So she sues him for breach of contract to marry. He has her taken to court and locked up in an insane asylum. And then he drives her there himself, and he bills the family for the transport costs. Right? Not his shining moment, right? And an important element that you can be the most sensitive painter in the world and still be a jerk, for lack of a better word. Right? Well, He stays with Henrika, and he's faithful to her for the rest of his life. They live out of wedlock all the way until her death in 1663. Right, so the next 15 plus years. In 1654, after they've been together for 7 years or so, Hendrika gets pregnant with a daughter named Cornelia. They're not married. She's called before the church council for living in sin with Rembrandt, right? Quote, this is from her trial. She committed the acts of a whore with Rembrandt the painter. Right? She's excommunicated from the church. Right? So, when we talk about Rembrandt's change in fate, there is this myth that his paintings had gone out of style. That the Night Watch was not well received. Rembrandt's paintings had gone out of style. And there's a little something to that. In that, after around 1650, a more refined kind of painting becomes more popular, like your fine painters from Leiden. Right? A more classical style becomes, that's sort of influenced by France, becomes more prominent, certainly more widespread. We get artists like Peter de Hoogh, Vermeer, very different from Rembrandt. Terborch, Metsu, right? Very different from Rembrandt. Becoming increasingly popular. So there is something to that, but there's also something to Rembrandt in a hell of his own making. Right? That has to do with as much as anything else. In 1655, Titus came of age. Right? Once that happened, Rembrandt was free to marry, and he didn't still. So this is a problematic issue, right? So social problems may have as much to do with it as changing artistic taste. It's important to remember that you can make too much of little things, right? As Rembrandt moved through his career, right, there's a wonderful little... Did you see that when we were there? It's such a great little picture of Titus in the Rembrandt house, writing at a desk. In 1655, he comes of age, and the next year, Rembrandt files for bankruptcy, 1656. He's just that kind of broke. And it's important for us as historians because we get an inventory. Everything he owned is drawn up because he's insolvent now. He's going to be forced to sell it off, right? So they're drawing up an inventory so he can pay off his creditors by selling this stuff. The only thing that's not in the inventory are his art supplies, and they are the specific physical supplies to make stuff with. So there's nothing in there about copper plates, right? There's nothing in there about etching needles. There's nothing in there about paintbrushes and canvases. But what is in there is his art collection, right? Is listed. Not one by one, but a portfolio of prints by Dürer. A portfolio of prints by Lucas. And the idea is he's got to sell it all off in order to pay off his creditors. But remember what we heard? Great deal that he works out with his wife, or with Hendrika and his son, that they open up a shop and hire Rembrandt. They open up a shop. He sells the big house, right? Moves outskirts of Amsterdam. And they open up a gallery in the model of the original one that Hendrik van Allenberg had, which is one where Rembrandt is the house artist working for the owners of the gallery. So his little son, a year after this was painted, is his boss, ostensibly. And they give him a pretty healthy wage, right? We talked about the fact that 200 guilders a year was a good wage. I think he got like 1,700 a year to be the house painter. And they would sell his works, and then they would put that money into the company, and that kept Rembrandt having to pay off all of his creditors. Right? They saved his ass, right, by doing this. And that remained for the last... But both of them died before he does. Right? So Rembrandt, by the end of his life, succeeded well. Okay. He continues to paint. He continues to make prints. He's already, even before the insolvency, sold off a lot of his plates, and they're being printed by somebody else. But he continues to make works of art. in the 50s and the 60s, up until he dies, right? And we've got some of these down in the National Gallery, quite a few small-scale religious and mythological pictures, small-scale history pictures. None of these are very big. This is about like yay, right? So they're for collectors, right? Works. And the images and the scenes that he chose, it's tempting to think about them all in light of what we know about his biography, that he's living this life that's a little suspect, that he's increasingly broke, right? To project on these images a sort of metaphoric content based on his biography, right? At the same time, many of them deal with the themes we've seen Rembrandt deal with again and again, spiritual versus physical sight, blindness, right? Metaphoric and physical are themes that he deals with regularly. So, very Caravaggio-like. It gets increasingly, even though he never met a Caravaggio, right? But really is channeling that, and again, that's the legacy of Levens in many ways, right? But these late works, this dark earth tone moodiness becomes even stronger, right? So, Philemon and Baucis, right? This is from Ovid, the Roman poet. Ovid talks about various stories of the gods. In this case, Jupiter and Mercury. Jupiter's in the middle in the armor. Mercury's got the light behind his head. Okay? Jupiter and Mercury come to the earth looking for a place to sleep, and they disguise themselves. I don't know why. It just makes a good story, right? They disguise themselves as peasants, and they're looking for a place to sleep. And they walk through town, and all of the rich people turn the doors against them. They're not going to give these peasants any handouts, right? You see how Rembrandt might like this story. He's broke, not necessarily looking for handouts, but, they eventually come to this cottage on the outskirts of town, this peasant cottage that's run by Philemon and Baucis, who are deeply impoverished, right? They're poor, poor farmers. And of course, what do? They take him in immediately, right? Please, we'll give you whatever we have. And they keep filling up their wine glasses to give them what little wine they have. And every time they do, the pitcher fills back up again, miraculously. They never really. So Mercury and Jupiter don't take anything from them, right? Because they still have the wine when they're done, because they can get away with that sort of stuff, right? And finally, they go to them and say, we are willing to sacrifice our prize duck for you for dinner. At which point, then, Jupiter and Mercury says, no, there's no need, we're not hungry, we're gods, right? But the fact that you've made the offer is what shows your character, right? So that's what Rembrandt gives us, is that moment when Philemon and Baucis on the left are bringing their prize goose, right, to Jupiter and Mercury. And it's the moment when they recognize the gods for who they truly are, right? Spiritual vision, right? Moment of blindness, metaphoric blindness disappearing. Which is for Rembrandt an utterly strong thematic trend that runs through his work, right? And so there we can see the goose, right, behind the table, right? And so what we're seeing, you and I, the viewers, we actually see Jupiter for who he really is. Because we see the gilded armor that he's wearing, right? And we see the beads in Mercury's hair. So we know that they're gods. And we share their vision at this particular moment, right? So it's important to think of these things, not only as they might relate to Rembrandt's biography, but also important that he's continuing to work, right? Regardless of circumstance, continuing to pound these things out. Another really nice small religious picture in the NGA is another circumcision image. And we've seen Rembrandt very much interested in Christ presented in the temple, going back to some of his earliest pictures, where Jesus is presented to Simeon the priest. In this case, little Jesus is as calm as can be, right? This is the typical kind of circumcision scene, rather than the screaming, howling Jesus that we saw before. Hang on. I had this one out when we were in the Rijksmuseum, and I found out why. Remember I told you guys I don't remember why I asked for that? I went back and looked at my notes at what I'd asked for. They have the plate. But they didn't bring the plate out for us, right? So they actually have the copper plate for this, and the idea was to see them side by side. But here he is again, right? Same time frame, more or less, just treating and retreating the theme. And you can see that the image of the Virgin Mary in the print is not holding Christ anymore, right? But in a very similar aspect. And now Christ is held by Simeon, whereas in this case, Simeon's kneeling in front of him, right? But each one of them, for Rembrandt, again, constantly going back and reworking things. Also sloppy. Right up here. See all this pitting around the ladder? Those are places where, when you lay down the wax on the plate before you scratch through it to make the etching, sometimes if you over-bake it, right, then it'll break apart. Or if you delay it, if you haven't cleaned your plate properly, if you haven't got all of the hand oil off of your plate, then it'll break up on you. It's really important to clean things. And Rembrandt everywhere, right down in here, you can see it as well, right? He has these areas where the plate's a mess, and he doesn't clean it up, and that's so typical for his works, right? That he has these messy plates that we talked about before. By the way, next week, Mary said she can take us in. We'll go look at how etching is made, because she'll have some students working on it next week. So we'll go take a look at that, right? These late works are extraordinary, first for the darkness, for the limited tonality, but especially for the paint, right? Rembrandt's paint in the last 2 decades of his life is just extraordinary in the openness with which he handles it, the degree to which he's aware of the potentialities and limitations and the physical nature of paint. And I think that throughout his entire career, there's something to be said. It's easy with Rembrandt to get wrapped up in the subject matter. It's easy to get wrapped up in the human qualities of things. So in this case, right, this is David playing his harp for King Saul. Right? And King Saul realizing through the music sort of the power of God. And so Rembrandt is focusing on that again, a moment of transition, right? A moment of metaphoric blindness revealing. And with Rembrandt's work, it's always important to look at these things, because that's one of his great strengths, is humanity. It's extraordinary, despite his dick-headedness, right? The extraordinary humanity that comes through his works, right? Again and again and again, is why we remember him. But the other thing is to step back and say, heck with subject matter. It's an object. Let's look at this canvas with this paint on it. And that's something we'll do on Sunday, right? But just look at that. And that's the robe of Saul. And it looks like a 1950s Rothko or something, or an abstract painting from New York City, right? That openness with the brush and the working of it. And there's something that he does, don't see as much here as we do in other works, but we'll see. He's going back, he's plowing into it, and he's just working the paint. And I don't think he knows where it's going. At the same time, I think he knows exactly where it's going. Does that make sense? Like, he's at a point where he's so in control of the paint that he can do things like load a brush with yellow and white at the same time and scratch across the surface, right? Right here, right? And come up with this effect that now when you back away from it, and in fact, one of the few letters we have from Rembrandt is saying, hey, don't look too close, back away from it, and it'll come in, the effect will be stronger, right? And that's talking about a much earlier work that's nowhere near painted like that, but that little bit of smear of yellow and white turns out to be like a buttonhole, right, or some sort of clasp on the inside of Saul's robe, right? It's just an extraordinary mastery of the medium, right? It's just, the thing that struck me most over the last year of looking at Rembrandt there is this element, the fact that these things are as good a dialogue between the hand and the brush and the canvas as anything you'll ever see in your life. And I mean that with utter sincerity. The Impressionists have nothing on him. Expressionist painters from Germany have nothing on him. That level, even, like, look, there's some scratchy bits in here, right down in there. There's some scratchy parts as well, right? He's one of the curators says he's performing, right? You watch this, you look at this painting and you can see him paint. You can watch him perform, and he's aware of how paint, this bit up here, right? When you add wet paint into wet paint, what happens? They smear together, right? But then you look at this bit right here, and you see what happens when you take wet paint over the top of dry paint, and how it skids, right? And he's utterly aware everywhere we look of sort of the different ways in which paint behaves. And I don't think there's anybody that was ever better. I really don't. When you get into it, especially the sorts of effects he gets with this, right? So the famous Jewish Bride, right, which we had a chance to stick our nose into, right? And just look at the range of paint qualities. I love how the red of her dress reflects up the side. So we started talking about Lassmann and how Lassmann had local color, right? Like coloring book color. The red of that robe of the guy that looks like a doctoral gown stays there. But Rembrandt understands reflected color, right? And of course, this is so much later in his career, but just that extraordinary way in which the red comes up and catches the side of that satin sleeve. But also the way he's building up, parts of the paint seem to be put down specifically to build up texture. And that we see it underneath other layers of paint, that it's there to build up texture. So these areas up in here, right, are built up texture through the paint that sometimes it comes over the top of to allow the brush to grab it. And then there's other bits in that look as if, this part right here in particular, look as if he's scraping at it as well, maybe with a knife or something, right, a palette knife that you would use to mix up your paints. The kinds of effects he gets when you look at these, I'm flabbergasted. I'm just flabbergasted. And I remember growing up with this, and I remember thinking about this image. It's just this kind of treacly image of love. Look, he's touching her, and isn't that just so sweet? But that's not what this picture's about at all when you see it live. This picture is about Rembrandt at the height of his control with the paint. And it's almost as if he's painting with dry paint. Like the way those things lump up like that, like he's putting it on, but it's kind of half wet and already half skinned over as he's painting it. And he uses it to get the rumpled sleeve so that when you do back away, it looks like he's deftly rendered little textures in there. But he's not. He's left the paint to do it itself. You know? It does. So Petria cleaned this picture. Right? She spent like 3 years cleaning this picture. And I can't imagine the pressure. Right? We talked about, like, these guys are professionals. They're not like idiots out there doing it, right? But yeah. And then the more you look at it, you see, look at there's that one touch of orange down there, you know, and it sits up on the surface. And And there are areas that, I don't know, I think he scraped it away. I think he scraped away the underlayers. There's a story that 1885, Van Gogh was in Amsterdam, and they just opened the Rijksmuseum, and he goes. And he sits down in front of this, he's with a friend. And the friend loses Van Gogh. And he comes back and he finds him sitting here, in front of the Jewish bride. And Van Gogh says, I would gladly give up food for a month if I could just stay here. Right? And when you hear that and you see this, it's just all of a sudden, all sorts of other things begin to make all sorts of sense. The way Van Gogh handles paint, right? And at that point in his career, he's still very muddy in his color, Rembrandt-like, right? But that is just, there are layers of things going on there. It looks like a rubbing, like he's taken, there was an artist in the 20th century named Max Ernst, called it frottage, which is French for rub. It kind of means something, it's what a guy does to you on the subway. That would be frottage. Right. But frottage, you put a piece of paper over something, you rub it for the texture, and you move it, and you rub it, and you move it, and you rub it. And what Ernst was doing, as a surrealist, was he was trying to figure out if he did this enough times, if something would emerge, and he could then turn that into some dream figure. But that looks like a frottage. That looks like a rubbing, like somehow Rembrandt scratched away till he found something in there. That looks like sleeve, you know? And it's just absolutely extraordinary, right? And you can see even that surface. And remember, he's spent all this time with etchings, where it's all about rubbing things into cracks and whatnot, right? There's areas here where you get the feeling that he's rubbing paint down into the grooves and rubbing it off of the high points. This is an etching in its way, right? These are extraordinary pictures. Just these late Rembrandts. I used to never like them, and it's because I was looking at it the wrong way. I was looking at the subject matter instead of the object matter. Does that make sense? That difference, right? And we'll have a chance. But again, look at these things and the freedom, but at the same time the control, right? The freedom to know that you don't have to do things the way they've always said you're supposed to do them. At the same time, the deftness and control to where, okay, so coming off the side of her bodice are these two fobs with little jewels on the end of them, right? But look at how it's painted. Look at, when you get up close, what it is. It's just a little of orange, and that's it, right? Her belt. And again, he wants the belt to be this bit of jewelry that is three-dimensional, that has highlights on the protruding bits. And so what is he? He's carved it, in a way, right, out of paint. Just amazing things, right, that he's achieving with paint here at the end of his career. We all marveled at this guy from the Rijksmuseum when we saw him, this charming fat man in a chair. Right? But again, his use of paint, right? That as you get close, you can see he's just, some of it's scratched, some of it's painted. A lot of it's built up layer on layer to when you get up close, you see colors that don't exist in human flesh, you know? And he's so good that way. I don't know if you guys were the ones that gathered around me when I was looking at this, but I saw something I hadn't seen last time I saw it. I think that's the great thing about these paintings, is that every time you come to them, you see something you haven't seen before. So on one hand, it's an important group portrait at the end of his career, right? And by the way, none of the pictures I've just shown you are small. So he's still getting good commissions, right? Can't forget that. He, in fact, did one of the paintings for the Amsterdam Town Hall, right? It was there for a little while before it got sent away. It's in Denmark now, right? But look at that tablecloth, right? And he's trying to capture the nappiness, the thickness of a tapestry on the table. But that just blew me away. The way the tablecloth opens up and there's green underneath it, you know? And again, it's this extraordinary ability with the medium that nobody's had at the time, right? And this is at a time when classical art is much more popular. So the question is the degree to which does Rembrandt just have a small circle of people, that loved this stuff, right, that we still love today. Sight and vision remain an issue for him, right? Homer was blind. Paul was struck blind, right, in these late pictures. And I think this palpable use of paint, this touchable quality, there's something going on there with all of this, right? Did a number of portraits toward the end of his career that cast himself and his family in religious guises. So there's a small sword behind his, in his armpit here, right? That makes him not Rembrandt anymore, but St. Paul, right? The apostle struck blind. And then finally, these two very late self-portraits. One very late, one 10 years earlier. It's almost like he looked older, younger, if that makes sense. When 59, he looked older than he does at the very... The one on your right is one of his 2 or 3 last pictures he ever painted. Self-portrait from the year he died in the Moritz house. And ours, looking pretty ragged. This is, 3 years after his bankruptcy, right? He's been rescued by his son and his lover, right? He's watched most of his children die. His lover's been excommunicated from the church, That raggedness, I think one of the extraordinary things about Rembrandt is the degree to which he doesn't try to hide it from us. That he doesn't try to make himself look special. Dandied up like Maria Tripp, to look better than he ever looked. He shows us in all of his extraordinary ugliness, right? Frumpy and saggy, and he ain't that old, right? He's 53 on the left. No, 50, right? He's only 60 on the right. I'll be 60 a year from now. So I like to think that I'm not quite that, partly because I don't have bozo hair, right? My wife said she'd slap me if I ever tried something like that, right? And I want to look at this in detail. We'll see him downtown. The paint, right? Because there has to be a market for Rembrandt self-portraits. He's not just doing them to do them. There's got to be a market for Rembrandt self-portraits. So somebody's buying these. There still is he's still important. But at the same time, this picture is ostensibly every bit as much about the handling of paint. And I firmly believe, look at his brow, how sensitively the brushstrokes follow the lines of the flesh. I wish they would let me do this. I wouldn't even ask. But I think if you took a rubbing of this, you could see it. I think you could see the face, right? You could make out the wrinkles around the eyes. But also, I think that this particular one is one of the best because of that, the look in his face. There's something so directly honest. And at the same time, it's full of emotion, but at the same time, it's almost empty. Right? We read things into it. That's just extraordinary. And then, talk about colors of the face that don't belong in your face. There's greens in there, right? Look at this. This would be a nice one to end with, right? Look at the edge of his nose, right? Just above the nostril on your right. Look at the part on his mustache just below that. And you can see that there's this sort of grayish green tone that he started off with, that he comes over the top with color after color after color, right? And then that wonderful tiny hint of light in his eye. How important that is. This is just, what an extraordinary work we have, right? Downtown. And what an extraordinary painter he was. So, John, have I convinced you at all of anything? You were saying to one of the museums that I may be in the minority because I like Vermeer. I love Vermeer. Don't get me wrong. But he's not overrated, right? He deserves his place in history, I think, because I don't think there's anybody that had as many, I used the analogy before, as many arrows in his quiver as Rembrandt did, that was as aware of what the medium could do that no one else had ever thought of before.
Put it into a
Mm.
way, where he took very traditional and knew what he could do and moved it into something that was different but still recognizable.
Yeah. Part of me wants to think that it's because he was a printmaker. I think that printmaking had a lot to do with what made Rembrandt work so well in paint. Because one of the things that comes out of printmaking, I might have told you guys this when we were abroad, right? But one of the things that comes out of printmaking is you realize that there's this process, and that you can distill the process down to, these are the steps. And with printmaking, it's all about like any surface that has an irregularity in it, you can turn into a print. That's the basic thing, right? And that what you do as a printmaker is you make those irregularities, but you can find them somewhere as well. The idea is that anything irregular can be printed, right? And once you get there, then the world starts to open up around you. Oh, okay. I'm gonna take my copper plate and instead of hitting it with acid and whatnot or carving it, I'm gonna run it over with a car. You know, I'm gonna take a hammer to it. I'm gonna make it irregular. Right? I'm gonna lay it on the concrete and pound it from the back. See what happens. Right? Rembrandt, we think, may have actually taken. We might have read about this. He might have made a paste out of acid and just painted it on there. You know, it's because once you understand the gist of it, then the world's your oyster, so to speak. Right? That's how he gets paint. He understands paint in a way that he understands potentialities that people didn't get for 400 years, not 300 years, right? 1950s or so. And I just find that absolutely extraordinary. And at the same time, then there's these other things to appreciate. If you don't even into that part, then there's the storytelling ability. Then there's the humanity of these, right? You won't find any self-portrait or any portrait that has the humanity of this, except maybe something by Frans Hals. Okay, Sunday we are at the National Gallery at 11, if you can make it. If you can't make it, please send me an email saying you're not going to be there so I don't wait for you. You don't have an option. You have to be there to give your talk, but come and support Monica and Emma on that. And then next week, what I'll do is I'll put these recordings up and the PowerPoints up as well. And if we have a reading I want you to do, I'll let you know well in advance, right? But for now, I don't think we'll have anything for next week. But we'll spend part of the time going across the hall to see how do you print an etching. Okay?